When I started medical school in 1995, until I had moved to Florida in 2016, all that time, all the patients I saw, 0 children expressing gender dysphoria. 0 in that whole time practicing, with all the psychologists I worked with all the social workers, with all the people. No one. We have created this problem, and these solutions are creating more of this problem.
Hey, Joyful Warriors, Tiffany Justice here, Joyful Warrior podcast. And today we are inviting a good friend of the podcast back. Natalya Murakhver, who was the founder of Restored Childhood, has been on the podcast before. Natalya came and told us about her Urgency of Normal Toolkit. Natalya, as I said, the founder of Restored Childhood, found our country in a moment where people needed information. They needed answers, and they needed to have those answers and information in one place. And so that Urgency of Normal Toolkit was incredibly helpful to so many parents, especially in New York, where they had questions. And we know the restrictions were so stringent in New York, with toddlers being masked, the longest of anywhere in the entire country. And I credit Natalya and the many people that supported her in helping America to fight back, certainly in the New York area during that time. We're also joined today by Dr. Kristopher Kaliebe. Chris is a child and adolescent psychiatrist. He has a longer bio that I've written down that I'm not going to try to memorize, because I'm going to let him share that himself. So, Natalya, Dr. Kristopher Kaliebe, welcome to the Joyful Warrior podcast. Chris, since I said I was going to let you introduce yourself, why don't we start with you for a minute and give people a little information and background about how you and Natalya got to meet.
I'm a board-certified child psychiatrist, a board-certified general psychiatrist, board-certified forensic psychiatrist at Psychiatry in the Law. I'm a professor at the University of South Florida in Tampa, Florida, and a child psychiatrist friend of mine said that she did great work with Natalya and that we should get in touch. And I looked up what Natalya was doing. I agreed it was great work, and we got in touch.
So, Natalya, America we find ourselves paralyzed during COVID. They're coming after our kids. We're watching as, bars are open, right? There's rioting in the streets, and yet they keep telling us our classrooms can't be open. The kids need to be masked. They were talking about vaccines for children. You created the Urgency of Normal Toolkit to help empower parents. And right now, we find ourselves in another time of crisis for children in America, with this idea of gender ideology spreading across our country, even as we see a lot of evidence from Europe and other places that are telling us, wait, this might not be the right path. This idea of gender affirming care might not be the best way to go about helping children. So you, once again, with Restored Childhood, have risen to the occasion and created a toolkit for parents to be able to tackle gender ideology and to understand it a little bit more. And I have it here. It's called An Urgent Conversation. It's a beautiful toolkit. So, Natalya, welcome again, and tell us a little bit about some of the work you and Chris have been doing.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's always great to talk to you, Tiffany. I met Chris about a year ago, a mutual friend who I'd worked with on Urgency of Normal, which I organized. I actually didn't write the toolkit. I didn't write that one. I didn't write this one because I'm not a doctor, and I didn't really have the facility with the data in the way that the people I work with do. And it's really incredible to be able to bring these minds together in a very concerted way to help parents empower themselves. So when this friend introduced us, she said, well, I can't really put my name on something like this because people who are institutionally affiliated, unlike Chris is fortunate enough to be at an institution that allows him to speak out. Not all can do that. There's a lot of censorship. Many of the doctors I worked with on Urgency of Normal got harangued, including Canadian doctors. They got dragged into their supervisor's office. They got redressed. Some of them no longer practice. So there's a huge risk, that they take by speaking out. But Chris and I started working together about a year ago. He spoke out on our Substack about not being allowed to organize conferences and seminars and write for, is it the American Association, ACAP, right, Chris? I don't want to misstate.
It's the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. It also includes the American Psychiatric Association. Those are both places where I've tried to submit presentations, and basically they will not forum actual rigorous discussion on the topic.
On the topic of gender ideology, just to be clear, they will not.
Correct.
They will not
Yes.
allow you to give any other type of countering input. Okay.
Yeah, they took official positions, even though they're, in theory, you would believe that a scientific organization would be neutral and they would follow science. But many of our professional organizations, back about 4 or 5 years ago, came out with documents that said, this is where we're going, this is what we believe. And I can pretty much prove to you that it's a very small minority of people within the organization that push this, slid it by. We're all busy people who were not really able to constantly stay on top of everything the organization is doing. And the same people then have sort of silenced and tried to stigmatize and use, censoring techniques to maintain a anti-scientific position. So that's basically
viewers of this podcast, that'll sound very familiar to them because we've talked about the American Academy of Pediatrics and their stance on gender affirming care and the fact that they have a very small board. I think it's a little over 30 people that come together that vote on different positions. And yet they have 60,000, 70,000 members across the country. And those members are not actually voting on those positions. So people within Moms for Liberty know and understand that oftentimes associations will take positions on different issues like this. And it's not really representative of the way that the whole membership feels. So Natalya, you get together with Chris. Chris helps you to dig in here to give tools and resources and information to parents. One of the things that I know you and I have talked a lot about is, first of all, parents deserve accurate information when making decisions for their children. They inform to have the right information so that they can make good decisions. One of the biggest concerns I had about gender affirming care, or so-called gender affirming care, was this idea I kept hearing, puberty blockers are reversible. And that is just not true. We know that is not true. There are harmful effects of puberty blockers for children. And boys put on puberty blockers, as I understand it, between the ages of 9 and 11. In studies, we know they go on to never have an orgasm in their lives, for example. So horrible things that happen to kids because of these drugs. Do parents really know those types of things that are happening? The Cass report, for example. So can you talk a little bit for a moment about some of the things that are happening or that we're finding out that are happening and research is showing across America that American parents need to be aware of?
Well, I think for one thing, we're not practicing the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle says an intervention is tested to death to make sure that it's safe before you unleash it on the masses. And our children are actually being used as guinea pigs, let's try it and see what happens. Like false promises are being made. Parents are being terrified, out of their wits. In some cases, states are, threatening to take custody away. I know some parents are afraid to even go to, a therapist because, child services may be called if they don't suddenly affirm, which, by the way, that's a gaslighting term. It's not affirm. Affirming someone is telling them they're okay the way they are, not that they need to change into something else in order to be okay. So I think that, empowering parents with a glossary of the terms, what they really mean, which is in this toolkit, is probably just like one of the ground floors of this whole thing. We need to have a common lexicon. We're not using language in the same way. Like we all need to agree on common definitions. So that's one thing. I think also this toolkit was first conceived of by a very progressive left-leaning journalist, very similar to what happened with Urgency of Normal. Urgency of Normal was developed by a progressive Bay Area father, Scott Balsitis, who was a virologist at the CDC, very pro-vaccines, very pro-CDC, guidance on almost everything else, who saw how much his own children were suffering in the Bay Area as a result of the crazy COVID mitigations. And he didn't want to see that anymore. So he designed that essentially for the audience, his friends, his peers, his school board, his school. He made something that he could bring to those meetings that he wouldn't be embarrassed about, that was very dispassionate and evidence-based, and that people could read and go, wait a second, like the science is actually pretty clear. My kids are suffering from the mental health pandemic, but COVID is not really a threat. Same here. The journalist who helped us create this was seeing some of the same kind of phenomena when it came to gender affirming care in her community. And she wanted to get through to the people in her community who were reading the New York Times and the Washington Post. So I think this toolkit should be able to unite the left and the right and bring them together to understand that this is in the best interest of the children.
It's hard to believe that this issue has become so politicized, right? That it's become this left versus right issue. And certainly we're trying, reading is another example of something, right? That has become somehow a left versus right issue. And it really isn't, Natalya. And I love the fact that you are trying to bring people together so that we can learn and understand the truth here. I want to dig into the toolkit if I could for a second. The first chapter, you talk about the school to clinic pipeline. So, Chris, I've had so many people say, right, well, what's the big deal? Just use the pronouns that the kids want, right? What's the big deal? Well, I was on school board and I found in our own school district that there were forms that were being passed out, 6 pages of forms where a child would have a different name at school. And then what name would you like us to use with your parents, right? What bathroom would you like to use? You have the Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights, really pushing for school districts to facilitate gender transition in school. You have new Title IX regulations that are supposed to go into effect on August 1st that are somehow going to now really embolden school districts to keep secrets from parents. So, Chris, what does it do, first and foremost, in the mind of a child for there to be a message sent to them that maybe home isn't safe and that school is?
Well, it drives a wedge between children and their families, and it makes the impression that the school knows better than the parent. And it seems to me incredible that a school would, on such skimpy evidence, actually, that obviously there are people who believe that this is a appropriate intervention. I can tell you there's not evidence to back it up that this is good for children to affirm them. And if a child does feel that they have gender distress, that is something that they can take to their therapist and they can talk about. But there's no reason a school needs to socially transition a kid or pretend that we're not evolved sexually dimorphic species. I mean, schools are supposed to stand for truth. And it seems really strange to me that a school would be backing away from human beings being a sexually dimorphic species. I mean, this is basic biology. It's a thing that I thought we had already agreed upon, many decades ago. And to, fundamentally collude with a child that they're a different gender than their biological sex, I don't think is helpful for kids. I think it's actually harmful. I know people believe it to be well-meaning. It also sets up this gender confusion with kids, which if we just would allow them to grow up, and this is one of the left-right issues that I think is really important to emphasize. For early onset gender dysphoria, the girlish boys and boyish girls that don't feel comfortable in their body, most of them will grow up. I mean, there's a large percentage that will grow up to be same-sex attracted adults. And so when we push them to not feel that their body is they were born in the wrong body, or there's something wrong with their body, we're pushing gender nonconforming kids into medical transitions that will harm them. So this is a very homophobic. This is, to me, one of the things that we need to get out and be explicit about. That this movement is not supporting gender nonconforming people. This movement is harming children that are future gender nonconforming adults, in addition to other vulnerable kids. So the idea that this is some kind of neutral or supportive act socially transitioning kids is not science-based, and it doesn't even meet the standard of common sense.
So let's talk about the kids who are vulnerable to this. So you've said gender non-conforming kids, the girlier boy, the more boyish girl. Our friend Chris Elston says all the time, no child is born in the wrong body. There is no right way to be a boy or a girl. But these progressive, they so-called progressive stereotypes are some of the most regressive things I have ever seen in my life. Let's talk about the other children that seem to be, I'm going to say targeted a little bit sometimes by some of this ideology. We're hearing that there's a large instance of children who are on the autism spectrum who end up becoming vulnerable to gender ideology as well. Can you talk a little bit about the development of a child and their brain, and how a child being on the spectrum might be more attracted to this ideology in some way?
Well, sure. I mean, one of the core features of autism is difficulties with social interactions. Plus, kids with autism have a lot of bodily sensation sensitivities, either being overreactive or hyperreactive. So kids with autism often do have difficulties with sensory things and with their body. They also often have trouble understanding social relations and getting along. They often have trouble making friends. Sometimes they're on the outs. They definitely can get bullied. They can be treated poorly by others. Now, when you throw in, and many of them are get hyper focused on a certain subject also. And when you throw in this ideology into the mix and they're exposed to it, it's not surprising that a subsegment of them will find this appealing and see it as some type of a solution to the problems that they have. And so unfortunately, kids with autism and other kids that are vulnerable, that have been abused, that are in foster care, that have, other mental health problems, are the ones that are being pulled into this and are more likely to be medicalized and more likely to be, and, we're sort of offering tangible short-term rewards to these kids.
Right.
And so they, short term, it can be, well, when you're 12 and then this change comes and you're celebrated and people accept you and you're now getting accolades and you're so brave and this type of stuff. I mean, the sad truth is we're not meeting these kids' needs, right? And we're failing them in some way. And then this is presented as an alternative. So yeah, it's a terrible situation.
So Natalya, you were at a recent event at Heritage. I was on a panel. We were talking about Title IX, and I shared my vegetarian story. That at 12, I had decided I was going to be a vegetarian, and then 6 months later, I changed my mind. But it was really embarrassing to tell everybody at school that I wasn't going to be a vegetarian anymore. And then I shared, imagine if you're a girl, and then you decide you're going to be a boy, and that you really were born a boy. And then everybody says, oh my gosh, you're so amazing. Here's your rainbow. And we love you. And we accept you. We're your family now. And, all of that. And then how do you walk that back? So let's talk about a little bit, Natalya, about what's happening in the schools, the lessons on gender identity, the curricula around it. Tell us, what's happening in the school to seed some of this. We know there's outside influence from social media, but, I know you want to help parents who've got kids in school who are, they're being inundated with this information in almost every subject.
Well, they need to understand that much of the sex ed and all of the gender curriculum is written by activists, not actual experts who have your children's best interest at heart. Even the CDC transgender guidelines, I accessed it yesterday. I mean, all the articles they link to are written by GLSEN, which is a huge activist organization. So talk about conflict of interest. I think that's deeply concerning. And as for what's happening, I think it really varies. You're living in a different fiefdom depending on who runs your school. Even if you have certain, stringent guidelines in the city, like in New York State has pretty stringent gender guidelines, but some schools enforce them and some don't. And for instance, in my daughter's middle school, where she just graduated from, on the very first day of school, they were asked for their pronouns. That was 3 years ago. She was in sixth grade. She was like, what is this? And so immediately they're very good at putting these seeds into these kids' heads. There's so much other stuff going on. And now they're trying to figure out what they are. Nothing is taken, at face value. Everything has to be questioned. Just to harken back to an old movie that I really love, You've Got Mail, which came at the very beginning of the Starbucks phase. Tom Hanks goes into Starbucks with Meg Ryan, and they're talking about all the different options. And he's like, do you want a short latte or a tall latte? Do you want an iced or decaf, oat milk or blah, blah? He's like, Starbucks is the perfect place for somebody who can't make a decision to have to make 25 decisions in one shot. And I kind of think of it the same way, like when you're asking these kids to re-identify themselves and to pick off of a crazy menu. That's what I think.
Based on stereotypes, based on stereotypes of what it means to be
Right.
a boy or a girl. Do you like pink, or do you like to play with dolls, or do you like sports? Just ridiculousness, Natalya. So
and they build on that. So by 7th grade in sex ed, my daughter was being taught that they were AFABs and AMABs. What is that? And by the way, I've talked to elementary school parents and administrators, and they don't even know. This is middle school. So AFABs are assigned female at birth. AMABs are assigned male at birth. So suddenly my daughter, who assumed she was a girl from birth, realized that it was only an assignment and she could be reassigned.
Okay, so Chris, I want to stop there for a second, okay? You're a kid, you're 5, you're 6, you are a boy. You know you're a boy. Your parents have always, no one needs to tell you you're a boy, right? No one assigned you a boy. You were born a boy and you've grown up a boy. Now the school tells you that maybe your parents were wrong about something that is very basic, right? What does that do? How destabilizing is that? What is happening in the mind of a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, even a 10-year-old when that information is being introduced in the classroom by an adult?
Well, I think it's quite destabilizing for some kids. And I think you also have to understand that this is being sculpted up year after year after year. So, yeah, you're creating, where there shouldn't be really any thought of these subjects. We don't need to be introducing any of these subjects to any of these kids. We do not need to be talking about these things. And you're introducing confusion, you're introducing ideology, you're potentially driving a wedge between the family and the kid. You're giving ways for kids to rebel and to show their individuality and identity, but in dysfunctional ways. So this is a non-healthy way for a child to, rebel or show they're different, or right. And so yes, it's, this is not and the kids don't really understand, of course, they're starting at such an early age. And this is even in the academic literature, that kids really don't understand that, we're sort of introducing concepts that frankly are relatively dysfunctional concepts,
nonsense.
even for adults.
It doesn't make sense because it's nonsense.
Yeah.
That's why. Right.
Yes. And they rely on stereotypes, and they really not, is it a felt sense, or is it a stereotype of the gender behaviors, or is it, so even the people who are spouting these things can't properly explain them without a circular reasoning. So yeah, it's incredibly, unproductive and not.
So Natalya, one of the lies that parents get told when their child says that they are, when a kid comes home and says, Mom and Dad, I think I was born in the wrong body. And then they go to the doctor, and I've heard the doctor says, do you want a trans kid or a dead kid? Do you want a live son or a dead daughter? And what we're seeing now is that, this idea of this suicide myth is being debunked left and right. There's always more than one reason that someone commits suicide. And oftentimes, as Chris, you've just shared, there are other, comorbidities that are happening here with a child that are bringing them to this moment where perhaps gender ideology or gender confusion is entering their lives. But what a scary thing for parents to be told. So Natalya, you address that in this toolkit. Do you want to talk a little bit about, let's dive into some of the things that parents need to know and understand that might be said to them about gender ideology or gender non.
Well, they keep saying that the science is settled, but the science is anything but settled. We can look over to the UK right now, and they've banned these procedures except as part of research trials. They've closed the Tavistock Gender Clinic. They've seen the outsized influence of these charity activist groups. Who is giving you this information? Like these organizations are all captured. And just like you talked about with the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, that this handful of elite experts, creates an illusion of consensus. There is no illusion of consent. There's no consensus. There's only the illusion of consensus. And it's the same thing even at, when it comes to teachers. right? The teachers unions create this illusion of consensus. They put out these documents, they push in these drag queen story hours into schools, and the American Library Association into libraries. But if you actually talk to like people on the ground and even members of the AFT teachers, they there isn't as much consensus as you think. So I guess,
But Natalya, they have the weight of the federal
right,
government
that's
on their side. We have the federal government that is pushing this information. So we can say there's an illusion of consensus. But for the average American person, they're seeing a trans flag flying at the White House. They're being told that gender ideology needs to be happening in their schools. Their children are being given surveys that are asking them, whether or not they feel like they want to kill themselves that day and if they think they were born in the wrong body. So there is, and then the CDC, Chris, to that point, is then, taking all of this survey data and using it to justify the interventions that they're doing in the schools. So, Natalya, at what point do we break through this idea of this illusion of consensus? At what point are these associations and these other groups going to be held accountable for any of this? Do you think? At what point would the American Academy of Pediatrics look at the CAS report and say, oh, wow, wait a second, maybe we need to reconsider what our guidelines are regarding gender
Wouldn't it be
affirming
great
care?
if all the pediatrician members of the AAP received this toolkit?
Absolutely. And so if you're a funder that is watching this right now, Natalya, what's your website? Can you please remind me of your website?
GenderToolkit.com.
Okay, so if you're a funder and you want to take a look at this toolkit, go to gendertoolkit.com and take a look. And Natalya could really use some help making sure that this toolkit gets into the hands of pediatricians across the United States of America so they have accurate information. Because I would imagine, Chris, it's intimidating. If you're a pediatrician and you have this association that you belong to, and American Academy of Pediatrics is the largest association that pediatricians belong to. I know that there's another association that's been started, American College of Pediatrics. And if you're a pediatrician that's watching this and you'd like to kick the American Academy of Pediatrics to the curb, please do that. But Chris, what does it feel like, and you're dealing with this obviously, as a doctor, to have associations that are really doing things and recommending things that are not in the best interests of your patients?
Well, I have a lot of feelings about that. It's embarrassing, honestly, because this is a failure at the most primary level of these organizations. Their duty to the public is to be scientific organizations first. And if the science says they should advocate on something, then that's a perfectly appropriate thing for the American Academy of Pediatrics to do. But when they take ideology and then they take a position, and then they basically try to shove that position down everyone's throat, and then try to stigmatize anyone who will actually stand up and say this is an anti-scientific, anti-child, and hostile, really, position you're taking. Then so this is the dynamics, and clearly the way that they call everything anti-trans is a technique, just like they do with the suicide and other kind of things. And so this has all been shaped up over many years with a lot of advocates that came in from really adult transgender stuff. And I think that we also in medicine have to talk about what is the evidence for adult transgender issues, because I think that's a serious issue too. But in children, the moral hazard is incredible. And the fact that we're now really polluting institutions that are supposed to be socializing and enculturating our children. So yes, it's shameful. I'm embarrassed. I'm trying to push back as hard as I can on mine. I actually have some conversations with people at the American Academy of Pediatrics too. I told them how I felt a long time ago. Can you make them change? I think at this point they've painted themselves into such a corner that I think only, extreme embarrassment and lawsuits and, this will eventually change. But I think we just have to start really ignoring them and realize that they're non-credible institutions, and we need to proceed as if they don't exist because we can't depend on them.
So, Natalya, let's talk about that. Because, American Academy of Pediatrics during COVID came out at one point and said that it wasn't going to hurt babies' development to not see their mom's face. Every mom in America knew that was a total lie. We knew that. You know, when you look at a baby and you smile, when you interact, how important that is with your baby. And so we rejected that right away. But, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the CDC, they played huge roles in a lot of the different guidance that the federal government would put out, a lot of the different recommendations that were being put out. A lot of school districts I know would use their statements as guidance, as justification for different actions they were taking. So, my concern is what is it going to really take to discredit them? Because you would have thought that COVID would have done it to a certain degree. And so now going forward, for parents, when they want advice and help, if they can't, where do they go, Natalya?
RestoreChildhood.com. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build this very evidence-based resource for parents that's not political and always tells the truth. And we're funding research. We did some mask research studies. We have Dr. Ram Durasetti, who's a Stanford physician, on our board, and we're hoping to do more research in the coming year, providing we get the funding. But I think in general, what Jeffrey Tucker has at the Brownstone Institute coined as the treason of the experts, I think that's really a good way to frame it all, right? I mean, and to also just pull in Michael Pollan talking about like food and saying, eat food that your grandmother would recognize. Like, we are born with intuition, just like any other animal on this planet. Like, if it seems like a strange thing to do, and if it seems like something that, raises your alarm bells, then maybe, take a time out and do your research. Your children are the most vulnerable beings, in the planet for you. Like, you are responsible for all of these decisions. Children cannot provide informed consent. Parents who don't have the right information, it turns out, can't provide informed consent either. So take a minute and think about the intervention and what the costs are, not short term. I remember when schools were closed and parents would be like, "Oh, my kid is thriving in Zoom." I'm like, over the course of 2 months, like that's not a good amount of time. That's not a data set that would ever pass muster. So you need to think about the long-term, implications of anything you do. Some things are more harmful than others. Turns out gender affirming care may be the worst. So
can I jump in here too and just say, for one, if you're having a conversation about how to support gender non-conforming kids, that's a reasonable conversation. We want to have that conversation. We're open to talk about that. That's a great subject. If we're going to try to pretend that affirming people as if they're born in the wrong body and having schools do this is good for kids, and that these medical procedures are good. When I started medical school in 1995, until I had moved to Florida in 2016, all that time, all the patients I saw, 0 children expressing gender dysphoria. 0 in that whole time practicing, with all the psychologists I worked with all the social workers, with all the people. No one. We have created this problem, and these solutions are creating more of this problem. And so this is the incredible thing. Ask any person who practiced back in that era that this is we have the same patient population, and now we've added to their anorexia or their autism or their depression, now gender dysphoria too.
Yeah. And one of the questions that I continue to ask is, in a school system, I served as a school board member, and if a child was expressing mental distress in any other way, you would absolutely involve the parent in that. If a girl was, throwing up in the bathroom right after lunch every day and teachers found out that she was bulimic, they would involve the parent in that conversation. They wouldn't go on to affirm the child's bulimia or the idea that somehow they were overweight if they were anorexic. And so the idea that this is different, again, Natalya, to your point, should you be just such an alarm? Like, we don't handle any other situation of a child experiencing mental distress by affirming that mental distress. Natalya, you mentioned informed consent. Chris, I want to talk to you about informed consent for a second, because one of the concerns that we have at Moms for Liberty is the expansion of something called community schools, which encourages school-based health clinics, right? And when you couple that with the lowering of ages of informed consent in places, I know people think this only happens in Washington State or New York, but in North Carolina, the the age of informed consent is 12. That means that children at the age of 12 are able to give consent. They're supposed to be able to know enough to make medical decisions for themselves. And then you have Seattle schools now that is going to be giving puberty blockers in their schools. Now, they say they're only going to be doing it if parents give consent, but the law doesn't require that in Washington state, because informed consent is the age of 13 and won't require parental permission. So can a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, I mean, I'm asking this and I'm thinking to myself, like, my son would have eaten Oreos all day long every day. But can a 12-year-old make these types of decisions, really give informed consent? Is that possible?
No, it's not possible. And all these same organizations have filed amicus briefs supporting these procedures, but also previously have filed amicus briefs saying that up to 18, and the American Psychological Association up to age 21, their brain is not developed, so they should not be held responsible for criminal behavior. So they came out with amicus briefs saying we, can't give someone life in prison or the death penalty if they're under 18, with all this science about how their brain is not developed and they can't make decisions and they're peer influenced and all those things. And they are saying it's okay at 12 to consent for these procedures. So it's pretty amazing how the exact same organizations can say the opposite in an amicus brief and then turn around and write another amicus brief, saying that, right. So this is the kind of organizations we're dealing with, right? It's insane.
So over the course of the past few years, I have had the privilege to meet some very brave young women who went down this path of gender affirming care, that had healthy breasts cut off, that were put on puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. I sat and listened to Chloe Cole when she first started talking about her mastectomy. And she said, I remember that the wounds from her mastectomy were still weeping. And it was amazing to me that a doctor would remove her breasts like that, and there was no care for her afterwards for any of the effects of this horrible, horrific mutilation that they're doing to these kids. And then she said, still remember, she said that, I'll never be able, I don't know if I'm going to be able to have kids, and I won't be able to breastfeed them if I do. And I thought to myself, these gender ideologues are thieves that steal something from girls that they, at some point in their life, they are going to desperately want. And they don't even know that when they're making this decision, right? At the age of 12 or 13 or 15 or 18 for that matter. I don't know about you, but I wasn't thinking about having babies and being a mom. And so detransitioners, the stories are hard to hear. They keep coming out. There are more and more people that are coming forward. I think courage is contagious, and these girls are seeing that they want to share their stories so other people don't go down that path. How do detransitioners and speaking to them and learning from them inform how you're now informing parents about this issue?
I think that just amplifying their voices, to be honest with you. I mean, I think that they need to have a much bigger microphone. We tend to only hear about the people who transitioned. Those are the most flamboyant, TikTokers, Instagrammers, like they're, all over the place. But these people who, are not as glamorous and have suffered so much and have had so much taken away from them, they're the ones, I think, their stories really need to be front and center. I know Independent Women's Network has done a fantastic series with detransitioners. There have been several documentaries made, including No Way Back, which I think was really great. I mean, listening to some of them talk about, one of them, I think, Kat Cattinson was a singer. And when she took the puberty blockers or the cross-sex hormones, her voice changed. And that was kind of her wake-up call of, wait a second, I'm not going to ever be able to sing the same way again. And so she didn't go any further because she realized how important her voice was. Well, so many people's voices are being taken away and changed forever. And just anecdotally, what Chris was saying about not having seen this phenomenon, in previous years, our pediatrician had said that in 30 years of practice, and she's a gay woman in New York City, and she said, in 30 years of practice, I'd never seen any child who wanted to change their sex. And in the last couple of years, I've had 6, and 2 of them were girls who had breasts removed, and came to see me to ask when would they grow back. I mean, that's how
Oh,
they don't, I mean,
Can I also mention that you would hope that the schools, even if we continue to be a society where we have some doctors who are doing unethical and really anti-scientific practices, and even if we have some parents who want to go along with those practices, schools should be a place where we do not endorse and encourage, and we stand for the truth. So you would think that schools would be one place of sanity in this situation, and they could be if they were being properly administered.
well, they could be, but so I brought you on to tell me about what you know, but I'll tell you a little bit about what I know. Now, parents want for school has not changed. They want their kids to learn to read, write, and do math. The majority of parents really do want that, Chris. But the truth is that the goals of schools have changed, and they are trying to awaken a critical consciousness in the child. And it's really never about the issue itself, whether it's, the CRT, oppressor or oppressed, or whether it's the rapid onset gender dysphoria and the gender ideology that they're pushing into the classrooms, or the anti-Semitism that we're seeing. It's division. It's meant to sow division and to destroy our country, to drive a wedge between the parent and the child so they can destabilize the nuclear family, which is the foundation of our country. And that's the goal. And so, unfortunately, we've got to stop it in the schools because gender ideology, has no place in schools. So parents have the fundamental right to direct the upbringing of their children, their education, their medical care, their morality, their religion. They do not have the right to abuse their children. Chris, if I brought my child into a doctor and I said he feels like a pirate, he says he's a pirate, I'd like for you to poke his eye out, and we want him to wear a patch and to cut off his hand and to put a hook on it. And I know there are probably some people listening who would say, oh, that's so ridiculous, Tiffany. You're being so ridiculous. But is it really that ridiculous? Because what we're doing is cutting off healthy breasts or scraping the forearm tissue or muscle tissue from children and creating fake penises that we're attaching to their groins and rerouting their urinary system. Lovely. So, what would happen if a doctor did that, if I wanted my child to go through that?
Well, obviously that would be malpractice, and but I think it's an apt analogy, right? I think that is a clear situation of indulging a fantasy of a child, but you also in that situation must have a parent who's going along with it. And I think the analogy is apt. There's a lot of these parents, though, some are mentally unwell themselves, but many of them are hearing things from doctors, they're hearing things from associations, they're hearing things from school. So it is unfortunate that there is a belief system, and I guess by analogy you'd be if the schools were saying that your kid might be a pirate and your doctors were saying your kid might be a pirate, and the medical associations were saying your kid might be a pirate, there may be some parents who bring their kid in and say, hey, make my kid a pirate. I mean, it's
I think
that crazy.
Honestly,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the idea of a boy being a pirate or a girl being a pirate makes more sense than a boy being a girl or a girl being a boy, right? I mean, honestly, so it is pretty crazy. And you're right, doctors would be held and charged with malpractice, and parents would be charged with abuse. And but here we have a lot of parents, as you said, that have been going along with a lot of this. I have to imagine that if you were a parent that has started your child down this path and made some of these decisions, that it would be very difficult to be able to admit that you've actually been complicit in the harm of your child. And so I think that that's something that as we move forward with compassion, and I am compassionate for parents who have been lied to about this and have have allowed their children to undergo any of this. Certainly if you're a parent listening to this and you've started taking some of these steps and you're thinking to yourself, I want to learn more about this, or maybe I've made a mistake, it is never too late to stop what you're doing and to do better by your child and to help them to get real help so they can live a happy, productive life. You can go to where do they go for the toolkit? GenderToolkit.com. Go get the toolkit and look it up. You have advice in here for parents of children who are experiencing gender dysphoria. Again, I'm going to say at Moms for Liberty, we do say there is no such thing as a transgender child. There are children that are experiencing mental distress, and we need to be compassionate and help them. And then you have tips for discussions concerning gender and school policy, how to reach out. And then you have a glossary of terms at the back that I think is great. So why don't you just give us a little run through of some of the different advice and tips and tools that you have in section 3 in your recommendations for
Well,
parents?
you've certainly, this is something I wanted to say from the beginning. I think that children need to be inoculated to the stuff that they're going to see in the schools and in the streets. So I think the first step is to really start talking to your child about what's going on out there. And it can be an age appropriate language, whether you introduce the genderbread, man and the unicorn, fine, go ahead. Like, all of these terms, all of these ideas should probably be brought up at home. I know some people are afraid to do that, but if you don't do it, they will. So I really think like parents need to take that conversation back. This toolkit's also, I think, quite accessible by, teenagers or even preteens. You can show them certain pages and have conversations and ask them about what they're learning in the schools. I mean, I was lucky my daughter told me, what they were discussing. But, when I mentioned it to some of her friends' parents, they have no clue. So your kids knowing that you're paying attention to this and that you've got their back is probably the most important thing, in my opinion, right? I think you bring the toolkit to the school. I mean, I've shared it with our principals. From what I can tell, they've downloaded it. So, you're arming both the administrators and hopefully your pediatrician. Why don't we re-educate the experts? Why don't we say that parents are the ultimate experts and it is our job to take our agency back and take our message out into the world rather than expecting the pediatrician to make that decision, the teacher and the principal to make that decision. We have to make those decisions for our kids and take responsibility for re-educating the world around us.
We do. I think, though, Chris, I'll ask you this question. At what point do we hold the so-called experts accountable for the failure, the COVID failure and the cowardice that they showed during COVID and the failure here in this moment to not take a stand against something that I think we will look back on as the greatest medical malpractice in the history of humans, honestly, trying to change the sex of children. When do we get to hold them accountable, Chris? What should really happen to the so-called experts?
Well, that's a great question. I think we need to get this period of time over with. And then we probably need a truth and reconciliation committee that will come in and have testimony and figure out what's going on. And, we probably have to forgive. I mean, human beings have done stupid, horrible things before, and we'll do them again. And we've had waves of ideology and bad medical practice and, entry into, really self-destructive and negative things in plenty of other spheres of life, and also in medicine. And, I know, in some ways people we want retribution and we'd like to have people punished, but I just would like good medical practice. I would like healthy kids. I would like us to move forward and forgive people who screwed up and did something wrong. But I would like it to stop.
You were nicer than I am. I'd like to see prison for some people. And I think we need to send a very clear message that if you see something happening and it goes against, do no harm, right? If it goes against your teaching and the commitment that you took as a doctor, that you are held accountable for that. And I think until we really start holding physicians accountable for some of the horrible decisions that they are making, it allows ideologues and activists to continue to come in and to corrupt our institutions.
If I could, I think a good place to start would be to go after really the leadership of the organizations, and it seems they've gotten off so easy. I mean, the presidents of these things, no one seems to be interviewing them, no one seems to be talking about it. I mean, their feet should be to the fire even prior to the CAS review. But the fact that we have a really solidly scientific review, which says that basically the opposite of what they're doing is the right thing to do, and makes it in an incredibly compelling way. So I think starting with the leadership would be the first people to really take on, and really they need to be a little bit stigmatized for them leaving science behind and opening the door to this, really bad practice, which has
Sure.
harmed people. So, yeah.
We'll end on
I
this
agree.
note. There's going to be a lot of litigation on this issue. I'm familiar with Campbell Miller Payne, 4 dads who have come together that are representing detransitioners. I hope, and they are working on some very important cases. We saw this podcast is going to air next Monday. My viewers know I'm a busy mom of 4 and I travel a bit, so I try to record in advance. Maybe someday I'll do live. But the Supreme Court today has said that they are going to review, they're going to take up the case of the ban of puberty blockers and transgender surgery for minors. And that's so incredibly important. So we are making incredible progress on this issue. 24 states have enacted some type of legislation around stopping the medical transition of children. And we are incredibly thankful for that. Natalya, I'm thankful for you for continuing to forge a path for parents and trying to create a big tent with compassion and understanding, giving people the tools and the information that they need to make the best choices they can for their kids. And Chris, thank you for being brave in a time when we, very much need brave doctors to stand and to show the way for the rest of the country. We really appreciate you. So Natalya, before we end, I'd really love if you could just tell people, how do they get to Restore Childhood? Remind us again where we get the toolkit. And then I know you do a lot of amazing work at Restore Childhood, so I'm going to give you a little plug here. If you are a funder and you are watching this, or you know someone who is looking to give money to organizations that are making positive change in America, that are truly putting kids first, please consider donating to Restore Childhood. They are a national nonprofit that was founded to protect children from governmental overreach in health and education. And they believe that parents are the best advocates for their children. And, at Moms for Liberty, we certainly agree with that. So Natalya, I'll give you the last word today.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. It's been wonderful being your friend all these years and just watching the evolution of Moms for Liberty, really a force. So they can just go to gendertoolkit.com or restorechildhood.com. They kind of lead to the same place and download the toolkit. We've also put up different collateral materials that you can print out, a postcard, a flyer, but I think they all have QR codes. So the toolkit can be, downloaded just through a simple scan of your phone. But I think one of the best things we have there is like a little business card that you can print up and just put in your wallet, and maybe just hand it to parents at the playground. If the topic comes up and say, I just found this resource, you don't have to take sides, and I'm curious what you think about it. Just don't let anyone chill your speech, and don't be afraid of the names they hurl at you. It's, sticks and stones, right? The sticks and stones can break our children's bones, but names will just empower us. So let's keep going.
I love that. All right, gendertoolkit.com. Go download this toolkit. Give it to everybody you know. And parents, I'll end on this note. Talk to your children's teachers about this issue. Ask them if they're going to be discussing gender ideology in the classroom. Tell them that you're concerned the school may be trying to keep secrets from you at some point with your child. And if they say that they would participate in some way in that, get your child out of that classroom. It is your responsibility to safeguard your child, and no one else is going to do it and advocate for your kid like you are. So, Joyful Warriors, thank you for listening today. Natalya and Chris, thank you again for joining us. gendertoolkit.com, and we will see you on the next episode of the Joyful Warrior podcast.